The second generation Ford Scorpio is widely seen as a car that was killed by its styling. And that is convenient. One look at the huge headlights, strange grille, and heavy rear end seems enough to make the reason for its failure obvious. But the Scorpio's unusual appearance was only one expression of Ford's corporate overconfidence, or perhaps even its stupidity. Through a series of bad decisions, the company destroyed its own European flagship. But let us start at the beginning. The new Scorpio's problems began during development. What is generally described as the second generation was, in reality, a major update of the previous model. The new Scorpio inherited its old rear-wheel drive platform, familiar architecture, 4-speed automatic transmission, and much of the existing engine range. The entry-level engine was a 2-liter 8-valve 4-cylinder, producing 115 horsepower, paired with a 5-speed manual gearbox. For a car around 4.8 meters long and weighing roughly 1.5 tons, that was clearly not enough. In normal traffic, this Scorpio was acceptable, but any attempt at rapid acceleration demanded almost everything the engine could deliver. For a large European flagship in the mid-1990s, that looked deeply unconvincing. A 16-valve version of the same 2-liter engine produced 136 horsepower and handled the heavy car noticeably better. But even this version did not make the buyer feel that they were driving a genuinely new Ford flagship. Above it sat the 2.9-liter Cologne V6 with around 150 horsepower. It offered more torque and suited the Scorpio better, but it was still a direct carryover from the previous model and from Ford's aging European engine range. By the mid-1990s, getting only 150 horsepower from almost 3 liters was no longer especially impressive. The engine was large, thirsty, and increasingly felt like a product of a disappearing era. The only Scorpio with truly convincing performance was the version powered by the 2.9-liter Cosworth V6, producing 207 horsepower. It could accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in around 9 seconds and reach approximately 225 kilometers per hour. But it was offered only with a 4-speed automatic, which softened the engine's character. As a result, even the most powerful Scorpio felt more like a very fast, large Ford than a genuine rival to the BMW 5 Series or Mercedes E-Class. The 2.5-liter VM Motori turbo diesel did little to improve the situation. It was another engine carried over from the previous Scorpio. It offered reasonable torque and economy, but it was coarse and noisy, qualities that did not sit well with Ford's attempt to give the car a more prestigious image. It would be wrong to claim that Ford simply placed a new body on the old chassis and did nothing else. The platform was updated, the body was strengthened, rigidity and safety were improved, and the suspension was extensively retuned. An old platform is not automatically a death sentence. The Mercedes W124 was also far from new by that point, while Volvo had spent decades refining the same basic engineering solutions. The real issue is not the age of the design, but what the buyer receives after it has been modernized. In the Scorpio's case, the old foundation was combined with old engines, a 4-speed automatic, and an almost unchanged wheelbase. Ford still marketed the car as an entirely new Scorpio. Automotive journalists quickly recognized just how much the new flagship had inherited from its predecessor. These marketing tactics damaged the model's reputation even further, which was already in terrible shape because of the styling. It is hardly worth trying to come up with more jokes about the Scorpio's appearance. Everything has already been said. The car has been mocked and criticized so relentlessly that one almost feels tempted, if not to defend it, then at least to find a few excuses for it. Even so, Ford's decision to approve such a design can only be described as foolish. The typical Scorpio buyer was fairly conservative. This was not a young person looking for provocative styling, but an executive, a government official, a business owner, a corporate customer, or simply a well-off family buyer. For them, a large Ford had to look solid, restrained, and reasonably prestigious, but never loud or eccentric. The most remarkable part is that Ford's management already knew this from experience. The first-generation Scorpio had given them a clear warning. When it debuted in 1985, the original Scorpio was offered only as a 5-door hatchback. For a car of this size and class, That was highly unusual at the time. Most buyers in this segment preferred traditional sedans, and many simply went to competitors that had chosen not to experiment. A sedan was finally added in 1989, while the station wagon did not arrive until 1992. Over 9 years of production, the first-generation Scorpio sold around 850,000 units. That was not a failure, but it was hardly a spectacular success either, especially compared with the previous Granada family, which had sold roughly twice as many cars. Experts and analysts largely agreed on one point. The decision to offer the Scorpio only as a hatchback had cost Ford a significant share of its potential customers. Ford's management knew this as well. It should have understood that the conservative Scorpio buyer did not welcome radical design experiments. Yet when the next model was developed, Ford took another risk, and a much greater one. Instead of a restrained evolution, the car received enormous rounded headlights, a wide, smiling grille, a heavy rear end, and an overall Americanized appearance. On a Fiesta or a small youth-oriented model, such eccentricity might have become an advantage. On a large executive sedan, expected to stand alongside the BMW 5 Series, Mercedes E-Class, and Opel Omega, it was extremely dangerous. The experience of the first generation was not Ford's only warning. Even before sales began, the company showed the Scorpio to a large group of motoring journalists at its design center in Cologne. Ford tried to explain the shape of the front end by referring to classic Jaguars, Alfa Romeos, and Austin Healey's. The journalists rejected the design almost unanimously. In other words, Ford knew about the negative reaction before the car reached the market. Yet the company had no intention of changing the design. It was not even seriously discussed. Corporate overconfidence apparently led Ford's management to believe that the same thing would happen with the Scorpio as it happened with the Sierra. Its aerodynamic shape had also shocked buyers at first, but over time it came to be seen as modern and familiar. The second-generation Ford Scorpio made its debut at the Paris Motor Show in October 1994, and no miracle occurred. The appearance of the new Scorpio shocked the public. Many people could hardly believe their eyes or understand how Ford had ever decided to put such a car into production. The discussion of the Scorpio's design quickly spread far beyond the motoring press. Its appearance was mocked in ordinary newspapers, general interest publications, and even television news reports. At the same time, reviews often admitted that the car itself was spacious, comfortable, well-equipped, and perfectly respectable to drive. But almost every compliment was immediately drowned out by discussion of the enormous headlights, smiling grille, and heavy rear end. The Scorpio found itself in a rare and almost impossible situation. Journalists praised the car itself, while also making it clear that its owner would have to defend its appearance. For a large executive sedan, this was especially damaging. A buyer might forgive an outdated engine or an old 4-speed automatic. Paying serious money for a car that everyone was already laughing at was much harder. Even so, in its first full year of production, 1995, Ford built 44,521 new Scorpios. That was, of course, far below the company's expectations and significantly worse than the result achieved by its main rival, the Opel Omega B. But 44,000 cars was still far from nothing. Despite all the controversy, the Scorpio found plenty of buyers. Some simply did not care much about its appearance. Others may even have liked it. Most importantly, behind those strange headlights was a very rational car for anyone who needed a large vehicle at a reasonable price. The Scorpio cost noticeably less than comparable BMW, Mercedes, and Audi models, while offering a huge interior, generous equipment, soft suspension, and a high level of comfort. A significant share of the early cars went to corporate fleets. Many companies already had agreements with Ford dealers, as well as discounts, servicing arrangements, leasing programs, and an established habit of buying vehicles from the same manufacturer. In those circumstances, styling mattered, but it was not always the deciding factor. Running costs, contract terms, and the size of a corporate discount could easily outweigh the strange radiator grille. Many of the first buyers were also owners of earlier Granadas and Scorpios. For them, moving to the new Ford flagship was logical and almost automatic. But in 1996, The already modest production figures fell by almost half and then continued to decline. Most likely, the first year had already gathered nearly the entire loyal audience for the model. Owners of earlier Granadas and Scorpios had bought the new flagship. Corporate fleets had completed their initial orders, and buyers willing to tolerate the styling in exchange for space and equipment had already made their choice. Once that first wave had passed, it became clear that there would be no second one. Surprisingly, the Scorpio styling may not have been the main reason for its failure. By the early 1990s, the market had changed significantly, leaving the model in a very difficult position. In 1993, Ford introduced the front-wheel drive Mondeo, which began to seriously challenge the Scorpio. It was cheaper, more modern, more economical, and already large enough for most corporate customers. More powerful versions were also available with a V6 engine. The first Mondeo was hardly a design masterpiece, but it looked traditional and understated. For most conservative buyers in this segment, that was more of an advantage than a weakness. Ford had effectively begun taking customers away from its own flagship. The Scorpio forced them to answer two uncomfortable questions. If all they needed was a large and comfortable Ford, why pay more for a Scorpio instead of a Mondeo? And if they were already prepared to spend serious money on an executive car, why not buy a genuine premium model? The Scorpio was not alone in facing this problem. The Opel Omega, Renault Safran, Peugeot 605, and several other models found themselves in a similar position. The entire class of large, non-premium sedans was beginning to lose its purpose, both for buyers and manufacturers. Despite falling sales, Ford still hoped to save its flagship and gave the Scorpio a facelift in 1997. The front end was revised, and the rear lights were darkened in an attempt to make the styling less controversial. But a facelift could not rescue a model that had already become an object of ridicule. In its final year, 1998, only 6,047 cars were produced. The Scorpio was then discontinued. Along with it, one of the most beautiful names in automotive history disappeared into the past. Around 98,600 second-generation Scorpios were produced in total, and the model received no direct successor. The Mondeo eventually became Ford's largest European car. After the Scorpio, Ford made no further attempt to develop its own executive car in Europe. The company already owned Jaguar, and in 1999 it also acquired Volvo. The role of a large, prestigious sedan could therefore be filled by models such as the Jaguar S-Type and Volvo S80. The Scorpio itself will probably remain a permanent feature in rankings of the ugliest cars ever made. Such lists should be treated with some skepticism. They stopped reflecting genuine opinion long ago and often do little more than repeat an established judgment. But in the Scorpio's case, its inclusion is difficult to call entirely undeserved. At the same time, it would be unfair to blame the designers alone. However strange their vision may have been, the final decision belonged to Ford's management. They approved the design and put the car into production despite every warning. I would be interested to hear your opinion. What do you think of the second-generation Ford Scorpio? Was it really that ugly, or did its appearance simply become the victim of decades of ridicule? Let me know in the comments.